Disabled veteran gets death penalty. Then her German Shepherd uncovers the shocking truth. The defendant will rise for sentencing. Judge Harrison's gavel echoed like a gunshot through the packed courtroom. Maya Rodriguez, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder. I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection. If this incredible story of loyalty and justice moves you, please like and subscribe for more amazing tales that will restore your faith in truth. The syringe gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the execution chamber, its contents clear as mountain water, but deadly as a viper's bite. Maya Rodriguez lay strapped to the gurney, her service dog Atlas pressed against the observation window, his desperate howls piercing through the supposedly soundproof glass. Any last words? The warden's voice was professionally neutral, but Maya could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. Even he seemed to question whether justice was truly being served. Maya's lips moved, but no sound came. The paralytic agent was already coursing through her veins, stealing her voice even as her mind screamed the truth that no one would hear. She wasn't supposed to die like this, not for a crime she didn't commit, not while the real killer walked free, not with so much left undone. Atlas's claws scraped against the glass, leaving streaks like tears on the surface. The German Shepherd's eyes, intelligent, desperate knowing, locked onto Maya's face. In that moment, she saw something that made her heart race. Despite the drugs, Atlas wasn't here to say goodbye. He was here because he knew something the courts didn't. The executioner reached for the final syringe, the one that would stop her heart forever. Maya's vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges, but she could still see Atlas pressing something against the window, a flash drive, small and silver evidence that could change everything. "Wait!" someone shouted from the observation deck. "Stop the execution. We have new evidence." But the words seemed to come from very far away, and Maya felt herself slipping into an abyss where truth and lies no longer mattered. 6 months earlier, Captain Maya Rodriguez had been living a different nightmare, one measured in sleepless nights and phantom pain that no medication could touch. Her apartment in Colorado Springs sat in the shadow of Fort Carson, close enough to hear the morning reveille that no longer summoned her to duty. The IED blast in Afghanistan had ended her military career along with the use of her left leg, but it had given her Atlas the German Shepherd, whose intelligence and loyalty had become her lifeline in a world that seemed determined to forget her service. Maya's days followed a careful routine designed to manage both her physical limitations and the PTSD that made unexpected sounds feel like incoming mortars. She woke at 0500, a habit that 15 years of military service had burned into her DNA. Atlas would already be alert beside her bed, his dark eyes scanning for threats that existed more in Maya's memory than in their quiet neighborhood. Together, they would navigate the morning ritual of medication, physical therapy, and the endless paperwork that defined veteran life. The VA disability process had been a second war fought with forms instead of firearms, but no less brutal for its bureaucratic weapons. Maya's case had been tied up for 18 months, her benefits suspended, while investigators questioned whether her injuries were truly service-connected. The irony was crushing. She'd volunteered for the patrol that had nearly killed her, leading her squad through a village where children played soccer between buildings that might hide snipers or IEDs. Colonel James Westfield had been her commanding officer during that deployment, a career soldier who'd risen through the ranks on the strength of his political connections rather than his tactical brilliance. Maya had respected him initially, but that respect had curdled into something darker as she witnessed his treatment of female soldiers under his command. The colonel had a reputation for inappropriate behavior that everyone knew about, but no one discussed, protected by an old boys network that valued loyalty over justice. Maya's apartment reflected her military precision. Everything in its place, surfaces clean, no clutter to hide potential threats. The only decorations were her commendations and a photograph of her squad 8 soldiers who trusted her with their lives. 3 of them hadn't made it home, their names etched on her heart like shrapnel that couldn't be surgically removed. Atlas had been assigned to her during her rehabilitation at Walter Reed, a specially trained service dog whose job was to detect the signs of an approaching panic attack and provide grounding pressure when the world became too overwhelming. But Atlas was more than a medical device. He was her partner, her protector, and often her only companion in a civilian world that didn't understand what she'd sacrificed in service to her country. The work Maya had found was part-time and poorly paid teaching self-defense classes at a local community center. It was meaningful work helping other women learn to protect themselves, but it barely covered her expenses. The delayed VA benefits had forced her to choose between groceries and prescription medications more often than she cared to admit. Her social life was limited to other veterans, men and women who understood the weight of carrying invisible wounds. They met at a VFW hall that smelled of stale beer and old cigarettes, sharing stories that civilians couldn't comprehend, and supporting each other through the daily battle of staying alive in a world that felt fundamentally unsafe. Maya's relationship with her family had been strained since her return. Her parents, immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give their daughter opportunities they'd never had, couldn't understand why military service had left her broken rather than stronger. They meant well, but their suggestions that she get over it and move on with her life revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma that no amount of explanation could bridge. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday evening while Maya was helping Atlas with his training exercises. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar Colonel Westfield, though he sounded different, somehow urgent and afraid. "Maya, I need to see you tonight. It's about your benefits case. I have information that could help." She should have hung up, should have told him to go through official channels, should have listened to the voice in her head that screamed danger. Instead, she agreed to meet him at his office, a decision that would lead to a death sentence and a desperate race against time to prove her innocence. The meeting was supposed to take place at 2100 hours in Colonel Westfield's office at Fort Carson. Maya arrived early, as was her habit with Atlas at her side. The base felt different at night, shadows longer, sounds sharper, the familiar landscape transformed into something alien and threatening. Her service dog sensed her tension, staying closer than usual as they made their way through the administrative building. Westfield's office was dark when they arrived, the door slightly ajar. Maya called out but received no response. Atlas whined softly, his ears flattened against his head in a way that meant danger. Every instinct Maya had developed in 15 years of military service told her to leave, to call for backup, to treat this as a potential ambush. Instead, she pushed open the door. Colonel Westfield lay sprawled behind his desk, his dress uniform soaked with blood from a wound in his chest. The metallic smell hit Maya like a physical blow, triggering memories of Afghanistan, of soldiers who died in her arms, of battles where she'd been too late to save lives that mattered. Atlas pressed against her leg, providing the grounding pressure that kept her from dissociating completely. Maya's training kicked in. She checked for a pulse, knowing she wouldn't find one, but following protocol anyway. She called 911, her voice steady despite the chaos in her head. She secured the scene, making sure not to disturb potential evidence, while trying to determine if the killer was still nearby. The murder weapon lay on the floor beside Westfield's chair, a military-issue knife that Maya recognized with growing horror. It was hers, the Ka-Bar she'd carried through 3 deployments and kept as a memento of her service. Her fingerprints would be all over it, her DNA embedded in the leather grip from years of use. "This is Captain Maya Rodriguez, reporting a homicide at Fort Carson Building, 1348, room 205. She told the 911 dispatcher, her voice betraying none of the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "One victim, male, approximately 50 years old, deceased from apparent stab wound to the chest." The military police arrived within minutes, their response time impressive even by Army standards. Maya stood at attention as they secured the scene, Atlas sitting perfectly at her side. She answered their initial questions with military precision, her name, rank, reason for being there, timeline of events. But as more investigators arrived, the questions became more pointed, more suspicious. Why was she meeting with Westfield after hours? How did her knife end up at the crime scene? Had she and the colonel been involved in any disputes? "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning," Sergeant Martinez said, his tone apologetic but firm. "This is just standard procedure." Maya knew it wasn't standard procedure. She knew she was already the prime suspect in a murder investigation that would destroy her life regardless of the outcome. But she also knew that refusing to cooperate would only make things worse. "I need to arrange care for my service dog," she said, looking down at Atlas, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "We'll make sure he's taken care of." Martinez promised, though Maya could see the doubt in his eyes. He was already building a case against her, already assuming her guilt. The interrogation room at the MP station was deliberately uncomfortable. Harsh lighting, metal chairs, a table bolted to the floor. Maya had been in similar rooms during her intelligence training, but always as the interrogator, never as the suspect. The role reversal was disorienting, making her question her own memories of the evening's events. Detective Sarah Chen led the questioning, a civilian investigator with the Colorado Springs Police Department, who specialized in military-related crimes. She was professional but relentless, probing for inconsistencies in Maya's story, looking for the crack that would break her composure. Captain Rodriguez, you say Colonel Westfield called you about your benefits case. Do you have any record of this call? Maya provided her phone, knowing they would analyze every call, text, and email. The colonel's call was there, logged at 1847 hours, lasting 3 minutes and 47 seconds. What exactly did he say during this call? That he had information that could help with my benefits case, that we needed to meet tonight to discuss it. Edith, did you find that request unusual, meeting after hours in his office? Maya considered the question carefully. Yes, it was unusual, but Colonel Westfield was known for working late, and my benefits case has been delayed for 18 months. I was willing to meet whenever he was available. The questions continued for hours, covering every aspect of Maya's relationship with Westfield, her financial situation, her mental health, her access to weapons. Chen was building a profile of a desperate veteran with motive, means, and opportunity, exactly the kind of suspect that would satisfy a prosecutor's need for a quick conviction. Captain, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you kill Colonel James Westfield? No, ma'am, I did not. But Maya could see in Chen's eyes that her denial carried no weight. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling: her knife, her presence at the scene, her motive for revenge against a man who'd been blocking her benefits. In the detective's mind, Maya was already guilty. The investigation would simply be a matter of proving what everyone already believed. As dawn broke over Colorado Springs, Maya was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Atlas was taken to a military kennel, his howls echoing through the MP station as they were separated. Maya watched through the window as her partner was loaded into a van, knowing that Atlas might be the only witness who could prove her innocence, if anyone was willing to listen to what a dog had to say. The Colorado Springs courthouse had seen its share of military-related cases, but the trial of Captain Maya Rodriguez drew national attention. Veterans advocacy groups rallied to her defense, while law enforcement organizations pointed to the case as evidence that PTSD made some veterans dangerous to society. The media coverage was relentless, turning Maya's personal tragedy into a symbol of larger debates about military service and civilian justice. Maya's court-appointed attorney, David Foster, was a former JAG officer who understood military culture but had limited experience with capital murder cases. He was competent but overwhelmed, facing a prosecution team led by District Attorney Patricia Hawkins, a politician with gubernatorial ambitions who saw the case as a stepping stone to higher office. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented Maya's knife as the murder weapon, her fingerprints clearly visible on the handle. Security footage showed her car entering the base at 2,045 hours and leaving at 21:30 hours, a timeline that matched the coroner's estimate of time of death. Phone records confirmed that Westfield had called her, but the prosecution argued that Maya had initiated the contact, luring the colonel to his office under false pretenses. The motive was painted in broad strokes: a desperate veteran facing financial ruin, her benefits delayed by a system that didn't care about her service, her mental health deteriorating under the pressure of civilian life. Westfield became the symbol of that system, the man whose signature could restore her benefits or condemn her to poverty. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, D.A. Hawkins said during her opening statement, this case is about a woman who served her country with honor, but came home broken. Maya Rodriguez couldn't adjust to civilian life, couldn't accept that her military service didn't entitle her to special treatment. When Colonel Westfield couldn't expedite her benefits, claimed she took matters into her own hands. Foster's defense was hampered by Maya's own honesty. She admitted to anger toward Westfield, acknowledged her financial desperation, confirmed her training with knives and other weapons. Her PTSD diagnosis became a double-edged sword, explaining her behavior, but also suggesting she was capable of violence. The most damaging testimony came from Major Robert Garrison Westfield, second in command, who painted a picture of Maya as an unstable veteran who'd made threats against her former commanding officer. Garrison testified that Maya had confronted Westfield multiple times about her benefits case, becoming increasingly aggressive and erratic. Colonel Westfield was concerned about Captain Rodriguez. Garrison testified his uniform crisp and his demeanor professional. He mentioned that she'd been calling his office, showing up unannounced, making demands. He was worried about her mental state. Foster's cross-examination revealed inconsistencies in Garrison's testimony, but the damage was done. The jury saw Maya as a dangerous veteran who'd snapped under pressure, exactly the narrative the prosecution wanted to establish. The defense's case relied heavily on character witnesses, fellow veterans, who testified to Maya's integrity, her leadership under fire, her dedication to her soldiers, but their testimony felt abstract compared to the physical evidence and the prosecution's clear narrative of guilt. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychiatrist who specialized in veteran mental health, testified about Maya's PTSD diagnosis and treatment. She explained that while PTSD could cause flashbacks and emotional instability, it didn't typically lead to premeditated violence. Captain Rodriguez's symptoms are consistent with combat-related trauma, Dr. Warren explained. She experiences hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and anxiety, but there's no indication of violent ideation or homicidal behavior. But the prosecution's rebuttal witness, Dr. Marcus Stone, painted a different picture. He cited studies showing increased rates of domestic violence among veterans with PTSD, suggesting that combat training combined with mental health issues created a dangerous combination. The most heartbreaking moment came when Maya's father, Eduardo Rodriguez, testified about his daughter's character. The elderly man spoke in heavily accented English about Maya's childhood, her decision to join the military, her dedication to serving others. "My daughter is not a killer," he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "She is a protector. She always protects people who cannot protect themselves." But even Eduardo's testimony was turned against Maya when the prosecution asked about her behavior since returning from Afghanistan. He admitted that she'd changed, that she sometimes seemed angry and distant, that he worried about her mental health. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Foster requested that Atlas be brought into the courtroom. The German Shepherd had been living with Eduardo since Maya's arrest, and the old man testified that the dog seemed to be searching for something, acting agitated and restless. "Your Honor," Foster argued, "Atlas is a trained service dog with exceptional intelligence. His behavior since the murder has been unusual, almost as if he's trying to communicate something about that night." D.A. Hawkins objected strenuously. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We're not going to allow a dog to testify in a capital murder case." Judge Harrison agreed, ruling that while Atlas could be present for emotional support, he could not be considered a witness. The decision was legally sound, but devastating for Maya's defense, cutting off a potential avenue of investigation that might have revealed the truth. As the trial progressed, Maya watched her life being dissected and reconstructed into a narrative of guilt. The woman the prosecution described, desperate, unstable, violent, bore little resemblance to the soldier she'd been or the person she was trying to become. But the evidence seemed insurmountable, and even Foster began to focus on avoiding the death penalty rather than proving her innocence. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one who'd followed the trial. Guilty on all counts, with the jury recommending death based on the heinous nature of the crime, and Maya's military training, which they viewed as an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one. Maya stood at attention as the verdict was read, her face showing no emotion despite the chaos in her heart. In the gallery, Atlas howled a sound so mournful that even the bailiffs looked uncomfortable. The dog knew, Maya realized. Somehow Atlas understood that justice had not been served. Death row at the Colorado State Penitentiary was designed to break the human spirit through isolation and hopelessness. Maya's cell was 8 feet by 12 feet, containing a narrow bed, a metal toilet, and a small desk where she could write letters that might never be sent. She was allowed out of her cell for 1 hour each day, spending that time in a concrete exercise yard where she could see a small patch of sky through razor wire. The appeals process had begun immediately after her conviction, but Foster was realistic about their chances. The evidence against Maya was strong, the jury's verdict unanimous, and the Colorado Supreme Court rarely overturned death sentences on appeal. Maya had perhaps 2 years before her execution date maybe 3 if they were lucky. But Maya wasn't thinking about appeals or execution dates. She was thinking about Atlas, who'd been returned to Eduardo after the trial. Her father visited once a week, bringing news from the outside world and updates on the dog's increasingly strange behavior. "He doesn't eat much," Eduardo reported during one visit, his voice heavy with concern. "He sits by the window watching. Sometimes he brings me things, paper sticks. Once he brought me a bloody rag from somewhere. I don't understand what he wants." Maya leaned forward, pressing her hands against the bulletproof glass that separated them. "What kind of papers?" "Old newspapers, mail things from the trash. But he's very careful with them, like they're important. And he keeps going to that place where you work, the community center. The manager called me because Atlas sits outside every day waiting." The pieces of a puzzle began forming in Maya's mind. Atlas wasn't just grieving, he was investigating. The dog's exceptional intelligence and training had been focused on a single goal, proving his handler's innocence. But without human allies who understood what he was trying to communicate, his efforts were meaningless. Maya's breakthrough came during a visit from Lieutenant Sarah Foster, David Foster's daughter, and a military police officer at Fort Carson. Sarah had been following the case unofficially, troubled by inconsistencies she'd noticed during the investigation. "Captain Rodriguez, I need to ask you about something," Sarah said, her voice low enough to avoid the guard's attention. "Major Garrison testified that you'd been harassing Colonel Westfield, but I've been reviewing the base security logs. There's no record of you entering the administrative building before the night of the murder." Maya felt her pulse quicken. "I never harassed Colonel Westfield. I called his office a few times about my benefits case, but I never showed up unannounced." "That's what I thought. Garrison's testimony doesn't match the physical evidence. And there's something else, the original forensic report on your knife. I've seen it, and there are discrepancies between what was presented at trial and what the lab actually found." The conversation was interrupted by a guard, but Sarah's words echoed in Maya's mind long after the visit ended. If Garrison had lied about her harassment, what else had he lied about? And why would he perjure himself unless he had something to hide? Maya began writing letters to journalists, to veterans advocacy groups, to anyone who might listen to her claims of innocence. Most went unanswered, but a few responses trickled back. A reporter from the Colorado Springs Gazette expressed interest in the case. A veterans' rights lawyer offered to review the trial transcripts. Slowly, a network of support began forming around Maya's claims. The most important letter went to General Patricia Winters, the new commander at Fort Carson, who'd replaced Westfield. Maya had served under Winters briefly and respected her integrity. The letter was a long shot. Generals rarely involved themselves in civilian criminal cases, but Maya was running out of options. 3 weeks later, General Winters visited the prison. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, settling into the visitor's chair with military precision. "Your letter raised some interesting questions about Colonel Westfield's death. I've been conducting my own review of the case, and I've found some irregularities that concern me." Maya felt hope stirring for the first time since her conviction. "What kind of irregularities, ma'am?" "Financial irregularities. Colonel Westfield was involved in approving contracts for veteran rehabilitation programs, millions of dollars in federal funding. Some of those contracts appear to have been awarded improperly, with kickbacks going to military personnel." The implications hit Maya like a physical blow. "You think Colonel Westfield was killed because of corruption, not because of me?" "I think Colonel Westfield may have been preparing to expose corruption, and someone killed him to keep him quiet. The question is whether that someone was willing to let an innocent veteran take the blame." General Winters' investigation had uncovered a web of fraud involving veteran rehabilitation contracts. Companies with political connections were receiving millions in federal funding to provide services that were never delivered. Veterans who should have been receiving treatment were instead being processed through a system designed to deny claims and pocket the savings. Colonel Westfield had been asking questions about these contracts, Winters explained. He'd requested audits, demanded documentation. Someone was getting nervous about his investigation. But why would he call me that night? What did I have to do with contract fraud? Maybe nothing, or maybe he thought you could help him. You were a victim of the system he was investigating. Your benefits, delayed your claims, denied. Perhaps he wanted to use your case as evidence of how the fraud was hurting real veterans. The meeting ended with General Winters promising to share her findings with Maya's legal team, but both women knew that military investigations move slowly and civilian courts were reluctant to reopen closed cases. Maya's execution was still scheduled, and time was running out. But as Maya returned to her cell that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Atlas had been right to keep searching, keep investigating. The truth was out there, buried under layers of bureaucracy and corruption. Now they just had to find it before it was too late. The revelation of potential corruption in veteran rehabilitation contracts transformed Maya's case from a simple murder trial to a complex conspiracy investigation. General Winters worked with federal auditors to trace the flow of money through a maze of shell companies and political connections, while Maya's legal team filed motions for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. But the most important investigator was still Atlas, whose relentless search for evidence had begun to yield results that human investigators had missed. Eduardo called Maya with increasingly urgent reports about the dog's behavior. "He found something," Eduardo said during their weekly phone call. "Atlas brought me a uniform military dress, blues covered in blood. He dug it out of a dumpster behind the base housing. I called that Lieutenant Sarah Foster, and she came to look at it." Maya's heart raced. "Whose uniform was it?" "Major Garrison's name tag. The blood is still being tested, but Lieutenant Foster thinks it might match Colonel Westfield's." The bloody uniform was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. How had Atlas known where to look? What had he seen or smelled that night that human investigators had missed? Maya began to piece together a timeline based on her service dog's exceptional senses and training. Atlas had been with her when they'd found Westfield's body, his behavior indicating the presence of danger. But dogs could detect scents that lingered for hours after a person had left an area. Atlas might have smelled the real killer's presence in Westfield's office, a scent he'd later tracked to its source. Lieutenant Foster became Maya's unofficial advocate within the military justice system, using her access to base records and personnel files to build a case against Major Garrison. What she found painted a picture of a career officer whose ambitions had led him into increasingly corrupt behavior. Garrison was responsible for approving rehabilitation contracts, Foster explained during a visit to the prison. He had access to millions in federal funding and the authority to award contracts without competitive bidding. The companies that received these contracts were paying him kickbacks through a consulting firm he owned. But why kill Colonel Westfield? Why not just transfer him or discredit him? Because Westfield had evidence, financial records, emails, documentation of the fraud. He was planning to take it to the Inspector General, maybe even to Congress. Garrison couldn't let that happen. The case against Garrison was circumstantial but compelling. He'd had motive to kill Westfield, opportunity to plant Maya's knife at the scene, and access to base security systems that would allow him to manipulate evidence. But proving his guilt would require more than Atlas's discoveries and Lieutenant Foster's investigation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Sergeant Tommy Willis, a records clerk who'd been afraid to come forward during the original investigation. Willis had been working late the night of the murder, processing paperwork in the administrative building where Westfield was killed. "I saw Major Garrison leaving the building around 2100 hours, Willis told investigators. "He was carrying a briefcase and walking fast like he was in a hurry. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but after Captain Rodriguez was arrested, I started wondering." Willis had more than just eyewitness testimony. As a records clerk, he'd had access to the original forensic reports on Maya's knife. What he'd seen didn't match what had been presented at trial. The original report showed multiple sets of fingerprints on the knife handle, Willis explained. Captain Rodriguez's prints were there, but so were others. Someone altered the report before it went to trial, removing evidence that would have pointed to another suspect. The altered forensic report was the smoking gun Maya's defense team needed, but obtaining it required navigating a complex web of military and civilian jurisdictions. The original report was classified military evidence, while the altered version had been used in a civilian trial. Getting access to both documents required court orders, federal subpoenas, and cooperation from agencies that preferred to avoid admitting their mistakes. Meanwhile, Atlas continued his investigation with single-minded determination. Eduardo reported that the dog had begun visiting the homes of various military personnel, sitting outside their houses for hours as if conducting surveillance. One of those homes belonged to Major Garrison. Atlas sits across the street every morning, Eduardo told Maya during a visit. The Major's wife called the police twice, but the dog isn't doing anything illegal. He just watches and waits. Maya understood what Atlas was doing, gathering intelligence, building a case through observation and scent detection. The dog was using skills he'd learned as a military working dog adapted for a civilian investigation that could save his handler's life. The pressure of the investigation began to affect Garrison's behavior. Lieutenant Foster reported that he'd requested a transfer to another base, claiming that the publicity from Maya's trial was affecting his ability to do his job. He'd also begun making mistakes, missing meetings, filing incorrect reports, showing signs of stress that suggested guilt rather than grief over his commanding officer's death. "He's cracking," Foster told Maya during one of her visits. "The investigation is closing in and he knows it. We just need one more piece of evidence to tie him definitively to the murder." That evidence came from the most unlikely source, Atlas himself. During one of his surveillance sessions outside Garrison's house, the dog had retrieved something from the Major's trash, a flash drive containing financial records that documented the kickback scheme in detail. Eduardo didn't understand the significance of what Atlas had found, but he dutifully turned it over to Lieutenant Foster, who immediately recognized its importance. The flash drive contained emails between Garrison and the fraudulent contracting companies, bank records showing illegal payments, and most damning of all, a draft letter from Colonel Westfield to the Inspector General detailing the corruption he discovered. "This is it," Foster told Maya during an emergency visit to the prison. "This proves motive means an opportunity. Garrison killed Colonel Westfield to prevent him from exposing the fraud, then framed you to cover his tracks." But even with overwhelming evidence of Maya's innocence and Garrison's guilt, the legal system moved slowly. Appeals courts were reluctant to overturn convictions, prosecutors were hesitant to admit mistakes, and bureaucrats preferred to avoid scandals that might damage their careers. Maya's execution date was approaching, and time was running out to prove her innocence through official channels. Her legal team filed emergency appeals, veterans groups organized protests, and media attention focused on the case. But the most important advocate was still Atlas, whose unwavering loyalty and exceptional intelligence had uncovered the truth that human investigators had missed. The final piece of the puzzle came when Atlas led Eduardo to a storage unit rented under a false name by Major Garrison. Inside, investigators found Colonel Westfield's missing briefcase containing the original financial records that proved the extent of the corruption scandal. With all the evidence finally assembled, Maya's legal team prepared for what they hoped would be their final court appearance. Not an execution, but an exoneration that would free an innocent veteran and expose the real killer who'd tried to destroy her life. The emergency hearing was scheduled for over 800 hours on a Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours before Maya's scheduled execution. The Colorado Supreme Court had agreed to review the new evidence, but their decision would be final. There would be no further appeals, no last-minute reprieve if they ruled against her. Maya was transported from death row to the courthouse in shackles, her orange jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the dress uniforms worn by the military personnel who'd come to testify. Atlas was there too, brought by Eduardo, and allowed into the courtroom as evidence rather than emotional support. The German Shepherd sat at attention beside Maya's chair, his intelligent eyes scanning the room for threats. District Attorney Hawkins had assembled a team of prosecutors to argue against overturning Maya's conviction. She maintained that the new evidence was circumstantial, that Atlas's discoveries were inadmissible, and that the original trial had been conducted fairly according to established legal procedures. "Your Honors," Hawkins argued, "we cannot allow a convicted murderer to escape justice based on the alleged findings of a dog and the conspiracy theories of military personnel who weren't present during the original investigation." Maya's defense team, now led by renowned appeals attorney Marcus Chen, presented a methodical case for her innocence. They showed how the forensic evidence had been altered, how witness testimony had been perjured, and how the real killer had manipulated the investigation to frame an innocent veteran. Maya Rodriguez was convicted based on fabricated evidence and false testimony, Chen argued. The real killer, Major Robert Garrison, used his position and knowledge of military procedures to commit the perfect crime, except he didn't account for the loyalty and intelligence of a service dog who refused to accept injustice. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Sergeant Willis testified about the altered forensic report. Under oath, he admitted that he'd been pressured by Major Garrison to modify the evidence, removing fingerprints that would have implicated other suspects. Major Garrison told me it was a matter of national security. Willis testified, his voice shaking with emotion. He said Captain Rodriguez was clearly guilty and that complicating the case with additional evidence would only delay justice. I was young, I was scared, and I made a terrible mistake. General Winters testified about the corruption investigation, detailing how Colonel Westfield had discovered the fraud and was preparing to expose it when he was murdered. She presented financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal kickbacks, emails documenting the conspiracy, and evidence that Garrison had been the ringleader of the operation. Colonel Westfield was a threat to Major Garrison's criminal enterprise, Winters testified. Killing him and framing Captain Rodriguez served two purposes: eliminating a witness and discrediting a veteran who might have supported Westfield's investigation. But the prosecution fought back aggressively, questioning the chain of custody for evidence discovered by Atlas, challenging the credibility of witnesses who changed their testimony, and arguing that the new evidence was insufficient to overturn a jury's verdict. Even if Major Garrison was involved in financial fraud, Hawkins argued that doesn't prove he committed murder. The evidence against Maya Rodriguez remains compelling: her knife, her presence at the scene, her motive for revenge. The hearing stretched into the afternoon with both sides presenting expert witnesses and forensic evidence. Maya sat silently through most of the proceedings, her fate being decided by legal arguments and procedural motions that seemed divorced from the simple truth of her innocence. The turning point came when Lieutenant Foster testified about Atlas's investigation. She detailed how the service dog had systematically gathered evidence, leading investigators to crucial discoveries that human investigators had missed. Atlas demonstrated investigative abilities that exceeded those of trained law enforcement personnel, Foster testified. His findings were methodical, consistent, and ultimately proved accurate. Without his efforts, the real killer would have escaped justice, while an innocent veteran was executed for his crimes. D.A. Hawkins objected strenuously to Foster's testimony, arguing that dogs couldn't be considered credible investigators. But Chen countered by presenting expert testimony about canine intelligence and the use of service dogs in law enforcement in military operations. Atlas is not just any dog, Chen argued. He's a specially trained service animal with documented abilities in detection and investigation. His handler, Captain Rodriguez, trusted him with her life in combat situations. We should trust his findings in this investigation. The final witness was Eduardo Rodriguez, Maya's father, who testified about Atlas's behavior since the murder. The elderly man's broken English and obvious emotion made his testimony particularly powerful as he described the dog's relentless search for evidence. Atlas know his mama's innocent, Eduardo said, tears streaming down his face. He never stopped looking, never stopped trying to help her. That dog has more faith in justice than most people. As the hearing concluded, Maya felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment: the helicopter crash in Afghanistan, the long struggle with PTSD and disability, claims the night she'd found Colonel Westfield's body, the trial that had condemned her to death. Everything had brought her to this courtroom, where her life hung in the balance of legal arguments and judicial discretion. The judges retired to deliberate, leaving Maya to wait in a holding cell with only Atlas for company. The German Shepherd had been allowed to stay with her during the recess, a small mercy that felt enormous given the circumstances. Maya buried her face in his fur, drawing strength from his steady presence, as she had so many times before. "Whatever happens, boy, you did everything you could," she whispered. Atlas pressed closer, his warm weight grounding her in the present moment, rather than the terrifying possibilities of the future. The deliberation lasted 3 hours, an eternity measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, Maya's legs trembled as she stood. This was it: freedom or death, vindication or final condemnation. Chief Justice Margaret Thompson's voice was steady as she delivered the court's decision. After careful review of all evidence presented, this court finds that substantial doubt has been cast upon the defendant's conviction. The altered forensic evidence, perjured testimony, and newly discovered physical evidence create a reasonable probability that Maya Rodriguez is innocent of the charges against her. Maya's knees buckled and only Atlas's quick movement prevented her from falling. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the veterans who'd packed the gallery, while D.A. Hawkins sat stone-faced at the prosecution table. However, Justice Thompson continued and Maya's heart stopped. This court cannot simply overturn a conviction based on new evidence alone. We are ordering a new trial with all charges to be reevaluated in light of the evidence presented today. It wasn't the complete exoneration Maya had hoped for, but it was life. Her execution was stayed indefinitely, and she would have another chance to prove her innocence in court. The new trial began 6 months later in a different courthouse with a different judge in a completely different atmosphere. Major Robert Garrison sat at the defendant's table, now facing charges of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and perjury. Maya sat in the gallery free on bail and wearing civilian clothes for the first time in over a year. The prosecution's case against Garrison was overwhelming. The financial records Atlas had discovered proved his involvement in the fraud scheme. The bloody uniform showed his presence at the crime scene. Sergeant Willis's testimony about the altered forensic evidence demonstrated his efforts to frame Maya. Most damning of all, when confronted with the evidence, Garrison had attempted to flee the country, a clear indication of guilt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor James Mitchell said during his opening statement, this case is about a corrupt officer who murdered his commanding officer to protect a criminal enterprise, then framed an innocent veteran to cover his tracks. Major Garrison betrayed his oath, his country, and a fellow soldier who had already sacrificed so much in service to America. Garrison's defense was weak claims that he was being scapegoated, that the evidence was circumstantial, that Maya was still the most likely suspect. But the mountain of evidence against him was insurmountable, and his own behavior had destroyed any credibility he might have had. The trial's most powerful moment came when Maya testified about the night of the murder. She described finding Westfield's body, the horror of seeing her own knife at the scene, the growing realization that she was being framed for a crime she didn't commit. I served my country for 15 years, Maya said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. I led soldiers in combat, I was wounded defending American interests, and I came home to fight a different kind of battle for the benefits I'd earned. I never imagined that a fellow officer would try to destroy my life to protect his criminal activities. Atlas was present for Maya's testimony, sitting beside the witness stand as she spoke. The dog's presence served as a powerful reminder of the loyalty and dedication that had uncovered the truth when the justice system had failed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Major Robert Garrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Maya's charges were formally dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. 1 year later, Maya stood before a different kind of audience at the grand opening of the Maya Rodriguez Veterans Advocacy Center in Colorado Springs. The facility, funded by a combination of federal grants and private donations, provided legal assistance, mental health counseling, and investigative services for veterans who'd been failed by the system. This center exists because of the loyalty of a service dog who refused to accept injustice, Maya said to the assembled crowd of veterans, military personnel, and community members. Atlas taught us that sometimes the most important investigations are conducted not by trained detectives, but by those who love us enough to never give up searching for the truth. Atlas sat beside the podium wearing his service vest and looking every inch the hero he'd proven himself to be. The German Shepherd had become something of a celebrity, featured in news articles and documentary films about the case. But to Maya, he was simply her partner, the one who'd saved her life not once, but twice. The center's first case involved a Marine veteran whose disability claims had been denied despite clear evidence of service-connected injuries. The second case was a female soldier whose sexual assault complaint had been buried by command officials more interested in avoiding scandal than protecting their troops. Both cases bore the hallmarks of systemic corruption that the center was designed to combat. General Winters, who'd been promoted to Pentagon leadership partly because of her role in exposing the fraud scheme, served on the center's board of directors. Lieutenant Foster had left active duty to become the center's chief investigator, using her military police training to help veterans navigate bureaucratic obstacles. The Maya Rodriguez case taught us that justice isn't automatic, Winters said during her remarks at the opening ceremony. It requires vigilance, courage, and sometimes the unwavering loyalty of a four-legged partner who sees truth more clearly than the humans around him. Maya's relationship with her family had been transformed by her ordeal. Eduardo, who'd stood by her throughout the trial and appeals process, now worked part-time at the center helping Spanish-speaking veterans access services. His faith in his daughter had never wavered, and their bond had been strengthened by shared adversity. The center's mission statement engraved on a bronze plaque in the lobby captured everything Maya had learned about service sacrifice and the importance of fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Every veteran deserves an advocate. Every injustice deserves investigation. Every truth deserves to be heard. As the ceremony concluded and visitors toured the facility, Maya found herself in the center's memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to veterans who died while fighting for benefits they'd earned through their service. Atlas lay beside her on the grass, content in the knowledge that his mission was complete, but ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The garden's centerpiece was a statue of a soldier and a service dog, their bond captured in bronze for future generations to understand. The inscription read simply, "Loyalty knows no limits. Truth knows no master. Justice knows no rest." Maya thought about Colonel Westfield, whose death had nearly destroyed her life, but ultimately led to exposing corruption that had harmed countless veterans. She thought about Major Garrison, whose betrayal of his oath had cost him everything. Most of all, she thought about Atlas, whose love and loyalty had saved not just her life, but her faith in the possibility of justice. The sun set over the Rocky Mountains as Maya and Atlas walked home together, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to fight for veterans who deserved better from the country they'd served. But tonight they were simply a soldier and her dog walking home together after a mission accomplished. In the distance, the evening bugle call drifted across the city from Fort Carson, the same melody that had marked the end of countless days throughout Maya's military career. But now it sounded different, not like an ending, but like a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in which truth mattered more than convenience. Loyalty mattered more than politics, and the bond between a veteran and her service dog had proven stronger than the forces arrayed against them. Atlas looked up at Maya as they walked, his intelligent eyes reflecting the streetlights and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. His tail wagged, once a simple gesture that said everything that needed to be said, mission accomplished. Ready for the next one. And in that moment, Maya Rodriguez, combat veteran, wrongly convicted prisoner, exonerated defendant, and now advocate for justice, knew that she was finally truly home.